Hey y'all, how's everybody doing? Welcome to Marathon 100. First, I can't stand doing long intros to these videos. They just waste so much time. However, if you'll just hang with me for a couple of minutes before we get started with these stories and listen to what I've got to say about an upcoming video, I think you'll appreciate it. I said I was going to do something, special to kind of celebrate Marathon 100. It's kind of cheesy, really, but, and I couldn't think of anything. I'm just not creative in that way. So what I have decided to do is I have a story that I've been holding back for about a year and a half. The story is from a woman in Colorado who has the equivalent of a skinwalker ranch where she lives in the plains of Colorado. It is a wonderful story. It's a scary story. It's awesome, and it's very long. To celebrate Marathon 100, tomorrow night, I think it will be Thursday, July the 23rd. This is the year 2020. At 7 o'clock Central Standard Time, I'm going to launch a premiere. It'll be released as a premiere. It's a 1.5 hour long video with just her story. It's an unbelievable story, and I think you guys are going to like it. A lot of people have wanted longer videos. Well, here's a long one. Immediately after that video or that premiere is over, I'm going to start a live stream, and we can all jump in and kind of discuss and bounce back and forth what we think about her experiences, because they are spectacular. They're real scary for her, but for us to hear these things, it's very interesting and intriguing. In addition to that, she has sent me 3 more encounters that she has had since she sent me the first part of her story, a lifelong story. I'm going to narrate those live in that live stream. So the live stream may be 45 minutes to an hour, and I'll probably talk about some other stupid, boring stuff. But if you want to join in, come in. It should be a fun night. So we're going to start at 7 Central Time. We're going to launch the video with a premiere. The video is going to be called Colorado Skinwalkers. And for all you Bigfoot fans, it's full of Bigfoots. The story's full of Bigfoots. So don't let the title throw you off. Everybody tune in. I think you're going to enjoy it. Leave her some nice comments, not for me, just for her, because she's a wonderful, wonderful person. And I'll tell you more about her in the live stream afterwards. So I wanted to run that by you. Let's get started with this video. This is 3 secondhand stories from a man who collects these stories. He is prolific with, he's like me in a way, in that anytime anyone's telling a story, my ears perk up and I'll listen and I remember them. I always remember the stories. And he's been writing these down, and I think he's been documenting these stories for a long time. And he's been good enough to share me a few. Well, I've already done a couple of his stories. They're back in Marathon 96 if you want to kind of catch up on what he's doing. So enough of that. I'm sorry to make the intro so long, but I wanted to really let you know about this video coming up Thursday night, tomorrow night, July 23rd at 7. It will release at 7 o'clock as a premiere. Thanks for listening, and let's get rolling with these 3 secondhand Bigfoot stories. All right, here we go. One summer morning a few years back, 2 friends, Dan and Josiah, went hiking deep into a canyon just outside of town. Their plan was to build a large teepee-like structure using fallen timber. It would be a gift to the area's Sasquatch people. They arrived at their destination about 3 miles out of town and paused to look around. By the looks of things, they'd probably need to venture a bit farther up the mountain and deeper into the woods for enough material for the structure. They blazed a trail as they made their way, adding another quarter to half a mile to the trek before they came upon a fairly level clearing with a tree stump near the middle of it. It was the perfect location for their gift. They split up and started collecting skinny 10 to 15 foot tall timber to erect into the structure around the tree stump. The stump would act as a table within the teepee. The door or the opening was about 5 or 6 feet tall. Once the structure was in place and standing on its own, they filled the gaps with smaller sticks and branches and leaves to help keep the rain out. When they were done, they left a granola bar on the stump and headed back down the mountain. After they arrived at their car, they packed up and began their slow drive back out of the canyon. Just when they were about to make the bend in the road, something moving up on the ridge caught their attention, and it was the ridge that they were just on. There, running on the ridge, was a reddish brown-haired Sasquatch quickly making its way down the mountain towards them. When the creature reached the edge of the hill and saw the car, it stopped and just looked at them. As they looked back at it, and as if it realized they'd seen it, it morphed into a tree, blending into the rest of the hillside. 1 second it was standing there, and the next instant it was a small pine tree. Was it a sort of defense mechanism or camouflage technique? Was it something they used to remain unseen from prey and humans? It really didn't matter at that point, as they'd already seen it. It would be a while before Dan went camping in that canyon. Everything seemed normal until one morning he awoke to find a small blue marble laying next to his sleeping bag. The marble had a piece of reddish-brown hair embedded inside. What did this mean? Was it a gift from a Sasquatch? Months later, Dan decided to venture out alone for an evening hike up another Forest Service road and then head off the trail to find a remote camping spot. As the crow flies, the location of this trip's campsite would be no more than 4 miles from the clearing him and Josiah had built that teepee. He didn't have to venture off the trail for too long before coming upon a nice level spot, perfect for his 2-person tent. He was surrounded by tall trees which served to block out any noise from town, which was less than a mile below. It wasn't long before camp was made and his dinner was gone. For good measure, he backtracked through the woods to find a tree branch to hang a small bag of garbage. That would hopefully keep any nosy bears distracted and away from his tent as he slept. Before turning in for the night, he pulled a canister of bear spray out of his pack and grabbed a book for some light reading. Nearly an hour later, he rolled over and turned out the light and went to bed. Sometime during the early morning hours, he was jolted awake by a deep rumbling feeling coming from the ground and the sound of a bulldozer crashing through the trees. It sounded like it was about 50 yards away and coming towards his campsite. The rumbling wasn't like an earthquake, but more like a stampede of horses or cattle running right at him. But how could that be? He was nestled deep in the woods and far away from the road, and he wondered, were there free-range cattle in the area, and were they possibly spooked or attacked, causing them to run away from a predator and unknowingly towards him? As the approaching violence got closer and closer, his sleepy brain was simply overcome by the trembling ground and loud crashing sound of the large trees right outside his tent. As he clenched his bear spray, he closed his eyes and he braced for an impact. And then everything stopped. Everything suddenly went quiet and peaceful. He opened his eyes and focused his hearing as he could sense something at the edge of the campsite to the left of his tent. There was no way he was going to look outside, so he continued to listen for any clue to what was out there. It took less than a minute for whatever was outside to turn around and slowly walk away in the direction in which it had come. Dan lay in his sleeping bag holding his breath. He could feel the heavy thuds from its feet as whatever it was walked away on 2 legs. Needless to say, Dan didn't go back to bed. He couldn't sleep. He laid helpless in his mind, replaying every second of the event over and over again, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Come morning, he cautiously unzipped his tent and slowly and quietly climbed out. With every inch, he paused all body movement and held his breath to scan the left and to the right before climbing out. He was pretty shook up. Whatever it was gone. There was no visible destruction within the campsite, and even more alarming, the trail back to the road was clear of any sign of violence he'd both heard and felt. Even the garbage bag was still tied above from the branch. Dan gave a lot of thought to what happened before telling me about that wild night. Whatever it was, once it found me asleep with the campfire put out properly, it turned around and it let me be, he said. I hadn't been making a lot of noise and my fire had been small, so I'm not sure how it knew where I was. Dan wasn't the only one to have follow-up experiences. During a solo hike, Josiah found himself about a mile or more outside of town on the opposite side of town from where him and Dan had built that teepee. It was early evening when he set out. As he hiked parallel to a river, he eventually came upon a batch of similar teepee tree structures. They had been created by Boy Scouts and varied in sizes and distance from the trail. Hikers and campers used them as shelters. After he passed the first structure, he suddenly felt like something was circling him. It was such a strong feeling it made him pause to look around to see if he could see anyone or anything nearby. That's when he felt the need to look down. There, in front of his feet, was an arrowhead, but it wasn't a normal arrowhead. Josiah is part Native American and has seen a lot of arrowheads and knows how to make them. This one was different. Whereas they're usually created using a chipping or flaking method known as flint knapping, this one seemed more like it was rubbed into shape. By this time it was getting dark, so he hiked up to one of the teepees and climbed inside to rest and examine the arrowhead. While inside, he heard small stones being tossed at the teepee. He leaned over and stuck his head outside, but he didn't see anyone. The sound of stones hitting the structure continued, so he decided to take the hint and move along. Obviously, someone didn't want him there. That's when things got a bit more strange. As he retreated back down the slope towards the trail, the stones continued to land all around him. At the trail, and after stopping to look for the culprit once more, a large piece of tree bark suddenly manifested from thin air right in front of him. He said it wasn't there, and then it was. He watched as it hovered in front of his face briefly and then fell to the ground. It was as if someone dangled it in front of him for a moment and then simply let it fall to the ground. This freaked him out, so rather than continue up the trail, he decided to quickly backtrack towards town. A ways down the trail, he realized he dropped the cap to his camera. Reluctantly, he turned back up the trail and used his flashlight to scan the ground ahead of him. Just as he spotted it and bent over to pick it up, someone threw something very large and heavy in his direction. When it made an impact with the ground, he literally jumped and yelled, "I'm just coming back for this!" Josiah then hastily made his way back into town and to his cabin. That was the last time he's hiked that area alone. The following accounts come from the husband of someone who I work with. She knows about people sharing their stories with me, so she asked if I'd like to meet her husband. What follows is an example of his strange and unexpected encounters while hunting. During the second week of October, my brother-in-law arrived at our hunting location just after 5 a.m. It was still dark out, and I like to get out and just settle in to allow my eyes to adjust to the darkness before I head out. As I slowly made my way past empty homestead horse corrals, I was looking for an opening or clearing to just stop, look, and listen. That's when I first smelled it. The odor reeked so bad it was worse than any bear or mountain lion that I've ever smelled. And that's when I felt like I was being watched. I slowly turned around and suddenly all the hair on my body stood up. That caused me to chamber around in my rifle, and I also unsnapped my holster so I could pull out my pistol in case I needed it. 10 to 15 yards ahead of me, I heard a tremendous roar that was so loud it shook my entire body. The timber was dark, and it was still dark out, so all I saw appeared to be a large dark shadow. I could see it standing upright and moving just near the tree line. As I turned to look at it, it was looking at me. By this point, it was less than 25 feet away. As I knelt down to take aim at it, I couldn't find it in the scope. It was too dark. While on my knees, I popped one of my 300 Win Mag rounds out of the magazine and onto the ground so I could retrace my tracks when it was light out. That's when the creature started moving down through the bush and trees towards the creek. When it took the first step, it was long and a deliberate step in a direction away from me. I could feel the ground shake when it took that step. I quickly retreated the 300 to 400 yards back to my truck, where I found my brother-in-law still inside. He was holding his pistol up and close to his chest. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. "Open the door," I told him, but he shook his head and he said, "No way." He heard it too and grabbed his gun. He said it made the hair on his body stand straight up just like me. We remained in the truck talking until the sun started to come up and we could see better. It took some doing, but I convinced him to come with me to where I saw this creature. After we reached the spot, I located that 300 Win Mag round and showed it to him. This is where it happened, and I pointed to a tree where it was. Now that it is light out, I could also gauge how tall it was standing beside the tree. "I'm thinking it was 9 feet tall," I told my trembling brother-in-law. We could also see and follow its tracks in the grass. As it was so heavy, it packed the grass down pretty good. So we followed the tracks along the road for a ways before I noticed that it curiously never stepped onto the road. It always walked alongside in the grass all the way down to the creek, where the ground turned to a really hard clay-like black dirt. You could tell it was really heavy when we could see the prints in that hard soil. That was an awful feeling. The creature's tracks continued across the creek and up into the dark timber on the other side of the meadow, and that's as far as we dared go. As strange as it sounds, we continued hunting the rest of the day, but didn't get anything. The next day, however, I had to remind my brother that we loved hunting for bull elk, and we could even see the elk about 400 yards to the east. He agreed with me, so we spent the day tracking elk, only to see cows, no bulls. While we were stalking the herd of elk, I told my brother that on the way back we could keep looking for sign from that creature, but he really didn't want to. He was still scared from that roar. The man continued the story that the following weekend, another hunter he knows well went hunting in the same area. In fact, the man's father-in-law owns the ranch we've all been hunting on where these stories took place. I didn't tell him anything about what happened the week before. This guy came back after the first day all scared, saying something was out there roaring and yelling at him. It evidently scared him so bad he said he's never going to hunt again. At this point, I interjected with the story of the team of the men who were cutting fuel wood and left everything up the mountain as they fled back down the mountain. That would have been in your marathon number 96. He said that location where it happened and where he's been hunting were only 3 miles apart as the crow flies. He proceeded to tell me about another incident where he was scouting in an area not far from where the Sasquatch scared him and his brother-in-law. And here's what he said. While hiking in an area where these are remnants of old gold mines from the late to mid-1800s, I noticed a deer stuck up in a tree. Its head was stuck in a wedge and its hindquarters were shredded apart. I looked for any sign of a mountain lion, but I couldn't see any tracks, drag marks, or even claw marks the cat would leave struggling to get the deer up the tree. Nothing. So how did the deer get up the nearly 15 foot into the tree, and what animal shredded it up? It was not picked at, it was shredded. On another trip, a friend and I stumbled upon a large teepee structure made out of large trees. The two of us tried moving the smallest of the trees, but we couldn't budge it. Then, in a more heavily wooded area, we found one twice its size. It would take a helicopter or heavy equipment to build such a thing. The trees were that big. He added that he has several friends who are veterinarians and taxidermists, and they want to go out with him to see what they can find, as he finds some really strange stuff. He went on to say, for example, during one trip, one of my friends discovered some strange hair. We had it tested, but the results came back unknown. I told him about Josiah's hike where he had the stones thrown at him while he sat inside the teepee. He knew that area well and continued with a couple of more experiences from the same area that Josiah hiked. He went on to say, while turkey hunting with my cousin, I told him that something big below us was making a lot of noise, but I couldn't see what it was. Together, we decided to pack it up and venture down the mountain to where the loud thudding and grunting noises were coming from. After adjusting in his chair, he continued, near the creek where the water had previously been high enough for the spring to run off to flood out a bit and then recede, I found a large log that had recently been stepped on. When I saw it, I knew one of the noises I heard from up the hill was from something very large and heavy stepping on it. I heard it snap, not crack like a smaller branch would make, but a loud, dull popping or crushing sound. I could tell it came from a thick log that was snapped, and here it was. Part of it was stuck really deep into the ground. Something very heavy must have stepped on it, and it had to be heavier than a bear, and that's all I can say about it. Again, I interjected, going back to the man who, after being yelled at by one of these creatures, said he was going to quit hunting. I asked how many people he knows who have gone hunting in that area and had something frightening happen to them. He answered, I know 5 to 6 men who were scared so bad they've quit deer and elk hunting altogether. At this point, I'd like to remind you and your audience that this ranch is easily within 2 to 3 miles from the location where the man cutting firewood had a rock land between him and his team. It's also within 2 to 3 miles from where Dan and Josiah saw the Sasquatch running along the ridge line after them, as well as where little Yeti's family cabin is. In fact, all of the stories I've shared with you thus far have been within a 10-mile radius of each other. The little Yeti story is coming up next, so you don't know what that is, but you're about to. Also remember in your Marathon 96, Billy, the boy who had sticks thrown at him before hearing kids giggling, then his dad put a can of Dr. Pepper outside only to have it disappear. Well, that family had several more encounters, including his wife Tammy having multiple close encounters with a large silver-haired male Sasquatch and even UFO sightings. I'll be sending more of those soon. Imagine dining in a restaurant and overhearing someone's waitress say to their table, "My nickname since I was a little girl has been Little Yeti." Her table had apparently been talking Bigfoot when she walked by. "Wait, what?" one of her customers asked as she was headed down the drink station. Their waitress turned back at them and smiled. "I'll be right back." After a few minutes, of which probably seemed like an eternity to those people, Little Yeti returned to their table. "What did you mean?" asked one of the men at the table. "Have you ever seen a Bigfoot around here?" "I sure have," she said, "many times. In part, that's how I got my nickname. I've sort of grown up with them." The three people at the table just looked at each other with puzzled looks on their faces. She continued, "One morning when I was younger, I looked out the window of our family cabin as my uncle was outside playing with his 2 dogs. It was about then that he noticed they were nowhere in sight. After repeatedly calling their names and also looking behind the cabin, he spotted them cowering under his pickup truck in the driveway. He called to them, but they wouldn't even look at him. What's going on? He wondered out loud. And then he noticed the direction they were looking was to the trees less than 50 yards directly behind him. At this point, everyone at my table continued to eavesdrop on the conversation, as their waitress paused for a moment and just looked at each other for her customers. Everyone at my table continued to eavesdrop on this conversation, as their waitress paused for a moment and just looked at each of her customers. The man in a green hat asked, "Okay, what happened next?" Well, before my uncle even turned around, the hair on his neck stood straight up. He was almost too afraid to turn around. As he slowly gazed down at the dogs again to see if they were still looking behind him, he slowly reached inside the truck and grabbed a Savage 30-06 hunting rifle. Once more, he checked with the dogs before he finally began to turn around. Little Yeti stopped her story to add that the woods around their family cabin has a long history of visitations from coyotes, black bear, elk, mule deer, bobcat, mountain lion, and if you believe some people, wolves and grizzly bear. Whatever was behind her uncle was scary enough to spook those dogs. Little Yeti continued, "My uncle cautiously swiveled his upper body towards the woods, holding the gun close to his chest. And then he saw it. Just outside of the trees stood a 7 to 8 foot hairy man watching him and his dogs. He was covered in brown hair and he stood motionless. I watched through the window as my uncle slowly lifted the rifle to his shoulder so he could look at this man through a high-powered scope. Just as he put his eye to the scope, the creature turned and ran into the woods." "Wow," said one of the men at the table. "Yeah, it took a couple of minutes before his dogs felt safe enough to leave the shelter of the truck. Okay, can I get you folks anything else?" Each of the three men at the table looked at each other, and then one asked, "So why is your nickname Little Yeti?" "Oh yeah, that's another story. Well, sort of," she said. They all laughed and chimed in together. "Well, we're not going anywhere, so carry on." "Okay, but let me check on my other tables first. Are you sure you don't need anything else while I'm here?" "We're sure. How about another round of that delicious root beer?" And she replied, "Coming right up." While she was away, the three of them just sort of looked off out the windows, probably imagining what it could have been like to experience a Sasquatch up in those mountains, especially when your two dogs are apparently unable to confront it. Seriously, many people go hiking with their dogs, hoping it will protect them. Maybe they would, but against a close encounter with a Sasquatch? My friends and I looked at each other and we smiled. Yeah, we're not going anywhere either. This is too good. It wasn't long before their waitress returned with 3 large root beers. And Little Yeti said, "Okay, so where were we?" One of the men said, "We're wondering where you got your nickname." Laughing, she said, "Oh yeah, that." The encounter I just told you wasn't my first time seeing one of these creatures while growing up at my parents' cabin. In fact, I've seen that particular Sasquatch many times before, so I'm not afraid of him. My uncle, though, that was his first time. He'd heard some of my stories over the years, but never had a personal experience before that. He didn't want to shoot it, just get a closer look. This will probably sound a bit unusual and maybe unbelievable, but when I was 7 years old, my parents and I were sitting in the living room of the cabin with the windows and the front door open. It was about the same time of year as now, so having the windows and door open allowed cool air to circulate through the house. Suddenly, my mother said, "Listen, do you hear that?" And we all stopped moving and tuned our ears towards the outdoors. "There, that. Did you guys hear it?" We all jumped up and we ran outside to get a better listen. And my dad said, "That sounds like an elk calf calling out to its mother." And we all looked at each other and began moving towards the sound. It didn't seem that far away, possibly just inside the trees where my uncle saw the hairy man. When we arrived to where we thought the sound was coming from, my mother said, "It now sounds like it's over there," pointing to our left another 30 or 40 yards away. Once more, we stopped where we thought the sound was coming from, but we didn't see anything. "There it is again," my mother said as she pointed back in another direction. "What is going on?" my father said. "It's like moving us around, but we can't see it." And this continued for quite a while, and before we knew it, we were quite a distance from the cabin. And then we heard the crying sound coming from the edge of a cliff. That cliff was nearly a mile from the cabin. And my mother said, "I don't get it. Where is this baby elk?" My father walked to the ledge and he looked down. "What the heck?" he blurted out. "Come look at this." My mother and I ran over to the edge of the cliff and looked down to see what he had seen. There, on a small ledge, was an elk calf. Somehow it became trapped about 25 feet down on a really small outcropping. And then my dad asked, okay, how would this elk get all the way down there without going over the edge? He didn't wait for an answer. I'll be right back. I'm going for a rope. You two stay here and keep an eye on it. My father disappeared back into the woods. Our cabin was now a mile away, so it would take a while before he returned. My mother and I sat down on a fallen tree and just looked down at the baby. Mom, how do you get down there and how could we hear it all the way through the woods to our house? Well, I don't know, honey. It didn't take my father as long to return as I thought it would. He appeared on the Ranger with ropes in the back. He said, you'll never guess what I found on the way to the cabin. The baby's mother is dead and her carcass has already been chewed on by coyotes. She's not far from here, just over that way. Dad tied a rope up to his harness into a nearby tree and then lowered himself down to the elk. My mom and I stood above him and asked, can we do anything to help? I'm going to lift the elk above my shoulders and try to climb back up. I need you guys to keep the rope to the side of the tree root so it doesn't get hung up, okay? Can you do that? Sure, honey, my mother replied. It took my dad about 5 minutes to get the baby up to safety. He was exhausted and sat down to catch his breath. The three of us just sat there looking at the calf. It was probably relieved too, but it didn't run off. It just laid down in the shade of my father. The waitress stopped there and she looked at her watch and said she'd be back for the rest of the story. One of her orders had appeared to be up, so she needed to take someone's food to the table. While she was gone, one of the customers said, poor baby. Yeah, I wonder how this story ends, said another guy. It was about 15 minutes before she returned to finish the story. Okay, we have to hurry with the rest of the story. I have more tables coming in, she said. We all piled into our UTV and took the baby elk back to the cabin. I was the lucky one who got to hold it during the ride. My dad slowed the UTV down at one point and pointed up ahead. That's the mother carcass right there. My mother then suggested that maybe the baby ran for safety, but ended up trapped over the edge. Maybe, said my dad, but there's no way it should have landed on that small outcropping and not fallen into the ravine below. Dad, do you know how we could hear it crying from way out there? I asked. I sure don't. A lot of this doesn't make any sense at all. He continued, for now we need to figure out what to do with this elk. We all remained silent the rest of the way back to the cabin. Bring the elk inside with you, my dad said as he took the machine out back and he parked it. And then little Yeti said, okay guys, to make a longer story shorter, the elk stayed with us until it was older, much older. In fact, it was too large to stay indoors. Can you imagine a long-legged elk walking around inside your house? One thing became clear over time. The more and more we talked about the details of what happened, the more the only thing that really made sense didn't make any sense at all. The cow elk was killed and the baby needed shelter. There's absolutely no way we would have heard its cries for help at that distance. We even tested it by yelling and playing loud music from the Ranger. We couldn't hear anything from that far out, even at night. So what are you saying? One of the guys at the table asked. I'm suggesting that the brown-haired Sasquatch helped us find the baby. We also found his large footprints near the ledge when we went back to test sound traveling back to our cabin. That one Bigfoot came around a few years following our return with the calf. It was as if he was checking to make sure that we had it home safely. Additionally, there's no realistic way the baby would have survived the fall 25 feet down to the tiny landing in which we found it on. We think that Sasquatch was mimicking the baby's cries to get our attention, and from a distance we could hear it. Then it lured us closer and closer to the ledge where we believe it placed the baby, so no predators could get at it. The waitress stopped for a breather and let it sink in with her customers, who just stared at her. Wow, that's an amazing story. But how did you get your nickname? One of them asked. The waitress just smiled at him. As the baby elk needed to be taken care of and watched after, my parents started calling me Little Yeti, as I took care of the calf like the hairy man looked after it. Over the years, the name just stuck. Her customers started laughing. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for sharing your story with us. No problem, she said. There's more to the story, and I have other experiences up at our family cabin. But I have to get back to work. Have a great night, and thanks for coming in for lunch. My two friends and I just sunk deeper in our booth as we looked at each other and smiled. What a story, huh? Yeah, I replied. You think it's true? I mean, do you think the Sasquatch really led them to the baby elk? Why not? She even said there's more to the story. I can't imagine what else happened, right? And that's the end of his 3 secondhand encounters. And this is an encounter he heard. This last one, the Little Yeti encounter, he overheard from another table at a restaurant. So if you guys ever wonder where these stories come from, here's an example of a strange way to get a story. I've actually got one of my stories from overhearing a guy talk about a Bigfoot encounter. But anyway, I want to take a minute and thank Todd for sending these stories to me. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. You're the good friend and a good sport for sending these to me. And I know everyone enjoys them. Hopefully I can get you for an interview, Todd, and you can tell us even more stories. It would be fantastic. Listen, thank you all for tuning into the video, Marathon 100. It was real fun to do, and we'll see you guys on the next one. I sure appreciate you. Thanks.